Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 educators in Tennessee through our online video library. These videos are aligned with standards set by the Tennessee Department of Education. For more professional development videos, check out our website at www.mtsu.edu/CEM.
Welcome to the ELL Collaborative here at MTSU. We are about to have a great session here with two presenters from Collierville Municipal Schools and Arlington Community Schools in Shelby County. As I've said to you before, we always ask for your feedback on these sessions and nominations of presenters. Well, we have a presenter that's been nominated to present today, Ms. Shelley Meisenheimer from Collierville Municipal Schools, and she has brought a colleague with her, Ms. Catherine Perry. And so I will turn it over to you to introduce yourselves and the topic.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for having us. I mean, being nominated is an honor. So I'm not sure who nominated me, but I would be grateful and tell them thank you very much. And my colleague is Ms. Perry. We have been teaching together in some capacity for about 20 years.
Yeah.
And we've done many presentations together.
Yeah.
So my name is Shelley Meisenheimer. I teach ESL at Collierville High School in Collierville. I have also taught ESL at the middle school level, and I have taught ESL at the elementary level as well, but high school is my heart. I love teaching high school, love graduating those ELLs. We are also adjunct professors for Louisiana State University in Shreveport, and we teach online classes for teachers who want to become ESL teachers. So I will let Ms. Perry tell you about herself.
So they call us Thelma and Louise.
Yes. We actually gave ourselves that name because we
but it fits.
It fits.
It fits.
It fits.
And we're just really tickled to be here, and we are very appreciative of the opportunity to get to meet all of you. We walked in, we were like, this is a big group. We've presented a lot in the past. I don't think we've ever presented to such a large group before, but we're tickled to be here and happy to meet all of you. Between us, we have had a lot of experience, and we have seen the world of ESL change a lot over the course of the past 15 to 20 years. Every year they throw new changes at us, and every year we put our heads together and go, okay, what's the best way to serve our students? Even though we're presenting on the WIDA framework, we want you to know we do not work for WIDA. We're just like y'all. We got our scores this week and went, what? And so our goal for today is to just try to be a resource for you and try to encourage you and try to give you some resources and tools that will help you meet your students' needs. And so we are open to any kind of collaboration and questions that you can share with us, okay? All right.
So we want to talk about WIDA and the standards and kind of the framework of how that is laid out. We are all familiar with the changes that have been made back in 2020. One thing that we want to do is simplify the language and kind of really dive into what is important. Because if you look at that manual, it's about 400 pages and it's overwhelming. And when your principals and your admin are asking you, well, what standards are you using? We want to be able to help you marry those content standards with the WIDA standards and make it a little bit more simplified. All right, so let's get started. Let's talk about the essential learning questions that we really want answered from that almost 400-page manual and kind of narrow that down. One of the things, what are the big ideas that we need to know and understand and apply? How does that compare and contrast from over the years? And that's one of the handouts that we gave you. We're going to be looking at that and looking at the comparison and the contrasting, what are the differences. How can I utilize those can-do descriptors for differentiated instruction? Because that's exactly what we want our students to have in the classroom, and we want them to have that in our classroom. We want to have that in the content classroom. How can my MLLs, by the way, if you're not sure what MLLs, that's multi-language learners. Some states use that, and they have switched to that. I know that in Tennessee, we're still using ELLs, but in some states and across the United States, they've kind of changed the language a little bit. How can I understand and apply the WIDA content standards to implement scaffolding and meet the academic language demands? Because that's what we want our students to be able to do, is meet those academic language demands. And then how does collaboration benefit? We all know collaboration, stakeholders, all of those buzzwords that Catherine's saying we have to roll with, because each year something new comes out. And collaboration has been a big one now for years. So how can we take those standards and how can we collaborate with our content teachers and our classroom teachers? All right, so I'm gonna let Catherine talk about the big ideas and the framework components.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the big ideas. I think one of the things, you know, when we hear people talk about the WIDA standards, how many of you have had somebody say, what about those new WIDA standards? And people are like, what new standards? I didn't know there were new standards. The standards are the same. We have the same 5 standards that we had in 2004. What has changed and expanded is that standards framework. In other words, we're beginning to look more progressively at what is being expected of our students, okay? And so let's kind of talk about that. We're looking at the integration of both the language and the content. We know that our standards include the social and instructional, and then they include those 4 content domains: social studies, science, math, and language arts, right? So as we're looking at that, we're talking about how has that expanded? Well, we're looking more at the functional approach. And as we look later at those standards, you'll begin to see that the emphasis is on the word for, right? So how are students using their language functionally and purposefully in the classroom? And we know that those expectations have changed over the course of the past 5 years, okay? Just in a very short period of time. So that's one of the things we want to kind of talk about as we're going along. So one of the things in the framework that has expanded is that key language uses. And again, key language usage is language across the content. When I give workshops in my district, I usually try to tell teachers, think about what I call HFHU, high frequency, high utility. So we know that our multilinguals come to us with a language, they're facing sort of a deficit in terms of the academic language that they need in the classroom, right? So if we think about it as a race, the way that we catch up in a race is not to go slower, but to go faster. And the only way to go faster, if you want to catch up in a race, is to focus on what is most effective. So the key language uses is one of the ways that we can sharpen our focus and begin to think about what is the language that is going to be needed most in those academic areas. And how do we as teachers make that language concrete for those learners? Does that make sense? Okay. Let's see if there was, I think that's all I was going to tell you about that. Organizing and coordinating that instruction. And so we've kind of focused, the expansion talks about narration, informing, explaining, arguing, all of those key language uses. So we're making the shift from just the language and shifting that to the purpose of the language. That's the best way I know to summarize it. Does that make sense for y'all? So we're more purpose-driven within this new framework. Okay? Does that make sense, Shelley?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
All right.
All right, so we gave you a handout that has the ELL framework, the comparison for the language standards beginning from 2004 to 2007, 2012, and then the 2020 edition that we're using now. So what we want to do is give you just a minute to highlight, identify key language terms that you see in the 2020 edition versus what we did from 2004 to 2007 to 2012.
Right.
What are those things that have shifted the focus, and how is that shift going to affect our planning and our instruction and helping our content teachers to also meet these language standards and these language demands? So we're going to give you just a few minutes to highlight, circle words that are new, words that you haven't seen before, and we want to kind of dive a little bit deeper into those words. So
And if I could just add to that, working left to right, look at the subtle nuances of the language, okay? And look for purpose-driven language in there, okay? And have those conversations with your shoulder buddy or your table mates, friends that you might have come with, and then be prepared to share out with us what your observations are, okay?
All right, let's start with what hasn't changed. What are things that have not changed?
We still have the 5 standards.
We still have the 5 standards.
Exactly.
That's not any different. There's no change in those 5 standards. What else has not changed?
The can-do philosophy.
The can-do philosophy has not changed. Can-do descriptors have not changed. Anything else that you see that has not changed? Grade clusters. Grade clusters have not changed. That's the same. The potential of our MLLs, of our ESL, our LLs, that hasn't changed. We still want them to meet academic standards and gain academic language. That has not changed. What has changed? What has been added, or what are words, key words that maybe you picked up on in there and you're like, that's a little bit different.
That purpose-driven language. I saw a lot of people underlining and highlighting that purpose-driven language. What did you all see?
It's the terminology that they used.
Can you give us
Instead
an
of just saying language, it said listening, reading, viewing.
Yes, very specific, very
expressive, different ways. And like I said, instead of just lumping it all into one category, they kind of broke it down more.
They have. They've definitely sharpened the focus. It is more purpose-driven. It's more explicit, if you will, in terms of what we're expecting from our students. Other examples of that?
So it's looking at that receptive understanding and that productive language. So it really broke that apart. And then the modes of communication.
Right.
That's different.
Can you give us an example of that, the modes of communication? Can you kind of elaborate on that a little bit?
I guess I see it as how they can, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, produce the language. So in what ways does it look for writing and speaking and representing what you understand?
I love that you used the word produce, because that was the word that we kept as we were preparing the presentation and kind of reflecting on the changes that we've seen most recently. It is, what is the student producing? You know, for the longest time it felt like the focus was on us helping the student to interpret American schools. And now our focus has kind of shifted to what is the student producing and how are you facilitating that productive skill set?
I think when we are asking our kids to understand text, if they're reading a chapter out of a textbook, what do we tell them? You look for these things because these words are important.
Keywords. Keywords.
Keywords.
Yeah.
And usually those keywords are in what kind of print?
Bold.
Bold print. So we didn't tell you that to begin with because we kind of wanted you to look at it. But if we look at the bold words on this 2020 edition, what are the bold words that stand out that you maybe are thinking that's kind of new information? Do we know multimodalities? Have we been using that word?
Yeah.
So maybe that multimodality, they have expanded the interpretive and the expressive, functional view of languages. We're going to talk a little bit about that. But those are things that we want to kind of dive a little bit deeper into, and how can we do those things. So we're going to kind of talk about how that focus has shifted. How can we apply that shift to our planning and our instruction? And then how can we also bring in and collaborate with our content teachers and our classroom teachers? So that's the second part of that handout that you have, that we gave you. So as we talk about form, function, and social context, one of the things that we notice in expressive is that they've added representing. And when we look at interpretive, they've added viewing. So it's no longer just listening and reading, and it's no longer just speaking and writing.
Right.
What do we mean by representing and viewing when we're talking about expressive and interpretive? So if we look at the definition of multimodality, we're using way more things with our kids. They have to interpret way more. They have to view way more information. They're diving into equations, maps, symbols, diagrams. Those of you that teach high school, we have to get our kids ready for that ACT. Science section of ACT is nothing but interpretation of graphs. They have to read graphs, they have to interpret it, they have to know the data. So it's way more than just speaking and writing now. We're adding representing and we're adding viewing. So the focus is on a much broader form of expression is what we're looking at. We're collaborating even more than ever. I mean, having been in ESL a long time, years ago when I first started, we really didn't sit down with teachers. I mean, you went and told them about your student and hey, the student is new and they're struggling with English, but the collaboration has really expanded.
When we began in ESL, you know, it wasn't so detrimental to be isolated because we didn't have a huge number of students. And so, but now we have there's not a teacher in my school that doesn't have an English learner, right? And so it's our responsibility to sit down and collaborate with all of those stakeholders and make sure that that they have the skills and the resources and the tools to meet their student where they are. So collaboration is huge, and I think that the framework incorporates that.
I think back too, if you remember several years back, when Jan Lanier was here, she all started that. She started that, hey, introduce your teachers to WIDA standards.
Right.
Let them know the key language uses. They're not necessarily bringing those standards in and throwing them at you yet, but get them familiar with them. And so now we're kind of on, I think what maybe is like year 3, and now we're actually able to take those standards and combine those standards, which is a great collaboration tool for us and for those content teachers.
And helping those teachers to understand the differentiation strategies that work for their students as well. One of the first workshops we ever did together was how to modify. And the gen ed teachers in our district really they wanted to modify for their students, but they weren't sure the best way and how to do it. And so just giving them those skills and modeling that for them and helping them to make the input comprehensible for their student. Because we cannot do it alone. We just, as ESL teachers, we cannot do it alone. If you think about the number of hours that we have our students and the gen ed teacher has their students, they have them a lot more than we do. And if we want them to succeed, we have to empower our colleagues to help meet their needs.
So I think one of the things that we noticed was they talked about functional language. So if you're familiar with Michael Holliday's work, he stated children by nature have a purpose for language. And so we have a function and we have some examples of classroom experiences that tie into those. So if you may be at the elementary level where you just want a student to ask for something. Can I go to the restroom? I need something. That's very instrumental. Then you have the regulatory. Do as I say. I'm giving you the information. You're determining the steps. You're following those. So he really goes through each level and gives us those language functions that our WIDA standard and our framework is giving us as well. I won't go through each one of them because you can read those and you have access to the PowerPoint. So.
All right, so one of the things we're going to do is kind of deconstruct the standards and the standards framework for you. Again, when you look at the standards are the same, but what WIDA has done is to go in and actually take the 4 in each one of those and ask themselves and ask educators, what does 4 mean in terms of social and instructional? When I first began, the 4 for social was, oh, well, can we do American school? Can we talk to our colleagues on the playground? I mean, when I thought about social, I just thought, you know, the real simple day-to-day basic BICS language. It's not like that anymore. The social language in a classroom right now means being able to work on a project in the classroom with 4 or 5 other native English speakers and be able to hold your ground. That's not just academic, that's social as well. Being able to advocate for oneself in the classroom, right? Knowing when to pick up on those social cues and allow somebody else a turn to speak, right? So just for each one of those content domains, what does the 4 look like? How is that purposefully taught and communicated to our students?
And I think that's a pretty powerful preposition. I mean, they're using very specific language. They want that for very specific purposes, for academic success in all of those areas. Instruction, for language arts, for math, for science, for social studies. So it's very specific, and that one preposition is quite powerful to me.
Yeah, I think what they did when we were looking at it, if you look at the framework, they took the word 4 and they divided it basically into 2 categories, thinking and producing. So what language do we use for thinking about science? What language do we use for producing in science? And they kind of broke it down that way and expanded it outward, which is wonderful. I know that it can seem overwhelming when you look at it, but we're going to give you some resources that kind of help you narrow that focus. And when you tap into those resources, you can begin to see that you really do have a lot of tools at your command.
All right, so breaking down the standard, we talked about it being expressive and we talked about it being interpretive. So when you're looking at these standards, it will break down that mode of communication for you. It will break down that key language use that you want. It can be very specific per grade level, per content area, and then it gives you the very specific standard along with the mode of communication, the key language use, the grade cluster that you're working with, and then what should they be able to do? That gives you those bullet points. So it really breaks it down, very specific when you dive down into the actual language standard. And what is it we want them to do with this specific standard? We want them to be able to orient audience to context. We want them to develop stories with time and event sequences. We want our kids to be able to sequence. That's a skill. Complication, resolution, ending. Those are all those story elements that you want your kids to know. Engaging and adjusting for an audience. So it really is very specific language once you dive down even further into the standard. So we kind of started with the overview of that framework, right? And then we kind of broke it down a little bit further into what are the things that we need to know. Well, we need to know interpretive, we need to know expressive, and now we need to know multimodality. We need to know the modes of communication that we want our kids to have, specifically the key language uses. And so we're hopefully breaking it down even further so that you can see that it's really not overwhelming once you kind of take away all the pages of that manual that don't matter. Because there's a lot of fluff in there, right? There's a lot of information, and we want to get down to what's the basics.
Okay. So now just kind of taking a look at some of the performance indicators. The model performance indicators within the WIDA standards. So if you'll look at this, this is where we begin to look at the function and the purpose of the language within those content domains. So if you'll look, so up there it'll say connection, and it'll give you a standard for that particular grade level. The standard might be compare and contrast the point of view from which different stories are narrated, including the difference between first and third person. All right, so then it has the context for language use. After a whole group, so this is an example, and it's a very typical example of what you might see in a language arts classroom, right? So after a whole group discovery activity exploring narrative points of view, the students then review example narrative text to discover how first and third person narrations convey different perspectives, something that happens in fourth, fifth, all these grades on up, right? So what do I need to do to move them to the demands of that standard, that content objective? So let's look at the MPI right there at level 3. Categorize passages based on narrative points of view. Categorizing the passages based on the different points of view. Well, if my student is right there at level 3, but the standard actually says compare, that's level 4. Compare narrative points of view, that's the standard. But my student is at level 3. So now I know, okay, I'm going to have to, in order for them to be able to accomplish this task, what scaffolding and instructional strategies do I need to empower them to jump to that next level? Do you see what I'm saying? From an analytical point of view, my student is at level 3. The standard demands that they accomplish what is at level 4. That might include things like language frames, tactile things where they can take the passage and actually move it, right? Helping them to understand the process of comparison. What does that actually look like? And then come on down here, here's another example. This is one of the strands within the ELD standard. This is for the language of mathematics. And notice the subtle differences from level to level to level. And what I'm going to do is take the level where my student is and compare that to the language demands of that content standard. And then as I'm producing my lesson plan, where my differentiation is, I'm going to figure out, okay, what do I need to do to move my multilingual from the language level that they're at to the level that is demanded by this content standard? Am I making sense?
Does everybody know the difference between a strand and an MPI? Because we're kind of talking about that language, but do we know what a strand and an MPI is? Because if we don't know that, then we need to make sure that that's understood. So the strand is that within the domain. Right. So in the reading domain, you have levels of proficiency. And then the MPI is within that strand. What is it that it's a model performance indicator. What is it that you want your student to be able to do? What should they be able to do at that level? Mm-hmm. And we know we don't want them to stay at that level. It's like Catherine said, we want them to move to the next level. So we're always pushing them from if they're at a MPI 3, level 3 in the language of mathematics, we want to push them to that level 4.
And Shelley, the way I kind of think about it for the strand, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I look at it, when I look at a strand, I'm looking at reasonable expectations at that level.
Yes.
When I look at the MPI, I'm looking at performance output.
I agree.
Does that make sense?
Yes, I agree with that. Yes. Any questions or any comments? I mean, we've been doing a lot of talking, so any questions, comments? Yes, ma'am.
I appreciate the clarity being a newbie, because a can do to me was this is what they can do, this is my focus, and you're saying this is where we can start.
That's it. I love it.
I love that.
Yeah, I love the way she phrased that. This is where we can start.
Yeah.
Yes. Can do doesn't mean can't ever do.
I think
means
it's a guidance.
I'm solid here. I'm solid here, but I know that I need to do more. And you, the teacher, are going to show me how to do more. And that's what we have to incorporate into our lesson planning.
I mean, for me, can-do descriptors are great for content teachers and classroom teachers.
Absolutely.
We know our students, we know what our students can do, we know where we want our students to go. Using this model, we know where we want them to go. But when you give teachers the can-do descriptors and say, look, this is what they're able to do right now, it immediately just kind of gives them a sense of relief. Oh, okay. Well, that's what I'm going to focus on what they can do in the classroom right now. So to me, I think can-do descriptors are a great tool.
They are.
For the teachers.
They are.
Not that we don't use them, but I think they're a super, super nice tool to give to your teachers and highlight where your students are right now and say, but this is where we want them to go. This is where we want them to get to.
And I have found in my experience that your content level teachers are really, really good and creative and innovative once they understand the difference between the existing language level and the language demands of the standard that they're trying to teach. And I think that has been the missing component in our collaborative piece, helping them to understand that there's a gap here between what our students' proficiency level is and what is being demanded of them. And I don't ever want a content teacher to lower their expectations for my students. What I do want them to do is put strategies in place to move them to where they need to be, because that helps me, right? It helps me as an ESL teacher that they are being held to the same standard and the same performance expectations as all the other students, going back to that linguistic complexity, we were talking about that. I don't ever want them restricted from, I don't want their accomplishments to be limited. But the teacher can't plan and create strategies if they don't understand that there's a little bit of a language gap there, and they're going to have to fill that gap.
Well, I think too, if we don't understand the WIDA standards framework, how are we going to take that back to our schools and teach in professional development, how are we going to teach them how to use these?
Right.
Because in our state, everyone is an ESL teacher.
Yep.
Even if you're a content teacher, you're teaching U.S. history, you're teaching math, you're teaching second grade. Everyone is an ESL teacher, and we need to help them understand how to use these as well. And I think the state marrying those is going to be fantastic, because it's just going to be so easy for them. It'll be right there. And you can just, as ESL teachers, our job is to support them and help them figure out, okay, this is how you're going to do that.
Right.
This is how you're going to meet that standard with a level 2 or a level 1 student.
And you're the expert in that building. You're the one they're going to be turning to and saying, give me some strategies because I want to help my student.
So on top of kind of breaking down, from the framework to the keywords that are bolded, multimodality, interpretive, expressive, the strands, the MPIs, they also go into the discourse, the form, and the vocabulary by proficiency levels. So I'm going to give you just a minute to look at the linguistic complexity for each level and kind of tell me what are the differences that you notice between these levels from a level 1 all the way to a level 5. So if we look at a level 1 through 3 and we're looking at the linguistic complexity for our students, what does that look like based on WIDA's information and their visual charts? What does that look like?
Kids follow your modeling.
You're modeling. Mm-hmm. You're modeling and they're doing, right? We used to call it, I I do, you, I do, we do, you do. That's what we used to say. That was the old terminology.
I still use it.
It is, but it's coming back. That's actually coming back. It's, if you stay in education long enough, everything makes, it's full circle. It all comes back around. What about if we look at the level 2 through 4 with linguistic complexity? What do we notice that's different from the 1 through 3?
They're comparing.
They're comparing and contrasting. So,
Following instructions without the modeling.
yes.
They're able to follow instructions without teacher modeling the.
Able to follow directions, right?
And why do you think that is? And when you're looking at level 2 to 4, why is there less modeling from the teacher? Do you know?
Because at this point, their understanding of the academic language is higher, and they're capable of producing work just using the terminology that is provided for them, granted that terminology has been taught to them.
Yes. Level 2 assumes or takes into account a certain degree of language proficiency already there. Absolutely.
And they cross over too, if you notice that. These
They do. They do.
Because students are all different. We know that. You know that you may have a really fast learning student, and they may jump up to a 2 to 4, and they be able to follow those directions independently and do that independently. So they're giving us some leeway with our students, because you know your students best, and you know what their proficiency levels are, what their ability levels are, and you know what you're pushing them to do.
Kind of goes to what one of our colleagues over here was saying. It's where you can start.
It's where you can start.
I can make this assumption, so I can start here.
Right. So then we look at level 3 through 5, and what stands out? What do you notice that stands out with linguistic complexity?
Expectation of prior knowledge.
Prior knowledge, absolutely. And then what are they doing? They've moved it from just measuring to writing. They did a great presentation, and they included the procedural writing. They showed us how that looks, what that looks like, and they modeled that for us, and we're doing that for our students. We start out with the modeling, then we're moving to more independent, and then we're moving them to actually writing. If you look at the language forms, you can also see that progression. They're wanting them to do what in levels 1 through 3 with language? Instead of writing 1 inch, they're writing 2 inches. So what is that?
Plural.
Plural.
But it's simple vocabulary. They don't.
Simple
there's not
vocabulary
complexity
still.
in it.
That's exactly right. The vocabulary is still simple, but you're teaching them how to form plural nouns. So it's giving you the information right there as to what the expectations are and what you should be doing in the classroom and what content teachers are doing.
Whereas as we move on, we're moving into comparatives and superlatives.
Exactly. And then into transition words, sequencing transition words.
Right.
So, we have to really use what WIDA gives us, because we're a WIDA state, number 1, and those are our standards. But number 2, they really lay it out and simplify it if we just take away the things that we don't need and just kind of focus on what we are going to be using. All right, so utilizing can-do descriptors. Well, first we're going to interpret our data. We just got our data. Some of us were super happy with our data. Some of us probably looked at it and said, what? How did that student get that score? That's lower than I thought it was. So we're interpreting data right now. We're in the process of deciding who's in, who's moving on, who's transitional. If we're in high school, are we putting them in a regular English class? Are we keeping them with content support? So we're making all those decisions, and interpreting data is a very important tool with our WIDA standards. We're defining their individual learning plan. We'll get that as our next step. We share that with our teachers so that they know exactly what their scores were. We know their growth trajectory. We know where we want them to go. And these are things that we need to share with our content teachers and our classroom teachers. If we're not sharing that information, they don't know our lingo. They do not. We have to explain to them what growth trajectory is and how important it is and how we analyze our data and our scores.
Shelley, before you move on, if one of the things that we implemented in our district this year is called the ESL Roundtable, and we do it at the beginning of the school year, and then we do it again in January. And this is when I sit down with our teachers and we look over all of the data, the benchmarking data from last year, the WIDA scores, any kind of data point for that student. I take them through their ILP and show them why I have chosen these accommodations and modifications and what they can reasonably expect. And we have an in-depth conversation about our student. And then we talk about how do we move them from the can start, I'm going to start using that, I'm stealing that just so you know, the can start to the will do. We're going to call that the will do. This is what we will do this year. And we talk about those growth trajectories and what we need, what their measures should be. And that is collaboration, and all of our teachers in the building this year have said how much that helped them. It helped them to understand their students' needs. It helped them to plan instruction. And it helped them to know that I'm there as a resource for them, that they can come to me with questions and concerns. Even if it's simply calling home and telling mom and dad, you know, Jimmy didn't bring his lunchbox, whatever. So if you haven't started doing an ESL roundtable in your district, I would recommend doing that.
And
your
y'all are
teachers will
required
thank
to do
you.
that, correct? You're required, your district requires
Our
you to
district
do that?
supervisor said, I think this would be a great idea, let's do it. I don't know, I mean, that to me, that's where it came from, was just, she created the ESL roundtable. We all do that in our buildings, and the teachers have loved it.
All right, so we're going to watch a short video, just kind of bringing all of those things together.
Teaching for English language learners is good teaching for everybody.
It is definitely about building their literacy skills, but also their confidence. I have a range of students from beginners to high intermediate students, so I use the inductive strategy because it can meet the needs of everyone.
Yes, making connections, because she said the word remember. This makes me remember.
The goal is to make the lesson accessible to all students. You want to see my picture? No, Dad. I don't like your picture. You do like or you don't like my picture? Oh, that makes me feel sad. Background knowledge is not just what students bring to the class and what they learned previously, but it's also providing students with the information they need to be able to access an upcoming lesson. Most of the students in my class actually speak 3 or more languages. Okay, English just doesn't happen to be one of them yet, so they're learning. Write it. Yeah, in Pashto or in Farsi.
Fair is not equal, you know, and it's true with differentiation too. I mean, not everybody will get the same exact text or use the same strategy, but it's fair because you're meeting every student where they are and we're helping them progress to the next level.
Okay.
So he said he don't like it.
Sometimes I pair students by same proficiency. Other times I might choose a more difficult text, but pair my beginners with a higher proficiency student.
Read title, middle school, the worst years.
An easy way to differentiate is to put videos at slower speeds. It's not just a list of strategies. It comes out of building relationships with students. When I was first learning Spanish, I was very scared. Creating an environment where students are willing to risk, where people can have a sense of humor. 2, 4, I teach English, not math. 2, 4.
I think of differentiation more like a mindset than on Tuesday I differentiate. You're constantly thinking, how do I make this accessible to everyone?
All right, last step.
So we all know Mr. Larry. He has been around for a long time and he has a wealth of knowledge, and he has a great website. If you've never used his website, he has a ton of resources. So he's a great ESL wealth of knowledge.
Yeah.
So if we're doing the old school templates. How many of you have seen this old school template? And this is what we used to use when we were doing standards, or if we were doing a professional development and we were diving deeper into standards. You know, our ESL directors would bring these and we'd sit in groups and we'd fill them all out, and it was quite a lengthy process, to say the least.
Too long.
And sometimes it was too long. And it's too much information. It's
and we were all sitting
overwhelming.
there going, just show me what it looks like in the classroom.
Yes, yes,
Just show me.
exactly. So, and even in my ESL methods class that I teach, I'm guilty. I still used that old school method. Just because it is, if you're just learning the standards, it is really a great tool to help you really get into the linguistic complexity and the language form and the vocabulary usage and what is it that you want them to do, where do you want them to go. So this is still a great tool. It's just a lot of us don't have time to do this. You know, we are pulled in 20 different directions every day, and we need simplicity in our lives. We definitely need simplicity. So if you have never used Standards Satchel, this is a phenomenal tool. I gave you a second handout because we're going to watch a short video. Has anybody used this before? Is this new? This is on the WIDA website, but it was buried way down in, and no one has ever shown me this. I just kind of found it by chance, and I was like, oh, why did we know about this before?
Right.
So we're going to watch just an introduction video that kind of introduces you to it, and then I'm going to walk you through. And with the handout, I like to call it guided notes, because when you teach high school, we need to keep them focused. And so I always have guided notes for my high school students. So these are kind of your guided notes for adults, just to kind of help you walk through the process and kind of write down information so that when you go back to your school, you're like, oh yeah, I've got that handout that kind of walked me through what it is. So I'm going to show you just a kind of an introductory video to what this does and what it is.
Today I'd like to share with you 8 ways to use the WIDA Standards Digital Explorer. Before we dive in, let's do a quick overview of the 4 major components of the WIDA English Language Development, or ELD, Standards Framework. We'll also take a quick look at rationales for using the Digital Explorer. There are 4 nested components in the Standards Framework. The first, the 5 WIDA standard statements, highlight the importance of teaching language and content together. Second, the 4 key language uses summarize broad patterns of language use across content areas. Third, the language expectations identify the most prominent key language uses for the 5 standard statements for one of 6 grade level clusters. And fourth, the proficiency level descriptors, or PLDs, can be used to gauge individual student progress at the end of a specific proficiency level. The PLDs measure progress toward the language expectations. The questions shown here on the right can be used to jumpstart collaborative planning. But how might you put the Standards Framework into action? Here are 2 sample templates for unit and lesson planning. But please remember, standards are not intended to be used as curriculum or instruction. Standards-aligned goals and objectives serve as guideposts. Why use the Digital Explorer? It can save you time. Saving 10 minutes a day can add up to more than 30 hours a year. Digitized standards can help you more efficiently write up unit goals and lesson objectives. They can help you more easily locate standards-aligned resources and improve your digital filing systems. The Digital Explorer offers multiple ways to explore and download the 4 components. So let's dive in. In the initial view of the Digital Explorer, you're given 3 pathways to explore. You can explore the language expectations from a content perspective or a language perspective. You can also explore the proficiency level descriptors. So from a content perspective, you can explore the language expectations by the 5 standard statements, and then break that down by grade level cluster. From a language perspective, you can explore the language expectations by key language use, and then by communication mode. And you can explore the proficiency level descriptors by grade level cluster, and then by communication mode. As you explore the language expectations, you can copy text to the clipboard, print, and pin. So I'm going to look at a language expectation, and it shows up on the tile on the right, and the bolding shows what changes as the grade level cluster increases. So I can copy this text to a clipboard, I can print it, I can also use the pinning function to go and view them for later uses. So say this one I've chosen was Language for Language Arts, grade 1, the key language use is Inform, and the communication mode is Interpretive. So I can go over to Standard 1 and choose the Standard 1 language expectation for grades K3, Inform. And I can pair those two together and use them in my unit planning. Let's take a look at how this might look as well. So you're pairing together language expectations for Standard 1 and Standards 2 through 5. Next, you can use the proficiency level descriptors to locate 5 high-level measures called the criteria of language, and those are arranged in a vertical list. You can also click on click to the right, click on the communication mode, and you can locate a simplified PLD chart for each grade level cluster. You can print that chart by going back to the communication mode and then selecting print this item and its descendants. So let's take a look at how that looks. So in your proficiency level descriptors, you can look within the communication mode. It will show the 5 criteria of language, and then it breaks it further down by the proficiency level. Or you can go back to the communication mode, and if you want to look at this simplified chart, it takes all the examples out just so you can see what changes as the level increases in the descriptors. So click on the 4-arrowed icon. That will expand the tile. And then if you're not sure of any terms, it also connects you over to the PDF document, and you can check the glossary. So say I want to print this. I'll go up to the communication mode, clicking on that communication mode, scroll down to the print functionality, and I'm going to print this item and its descendants. The reason you're doing this is that we place the simplified chart in the supplemental information area. And to make that show up, it's an HTML chart, you need to go and select the levels above it. Next, you can use the Show Associations button to view the language expectations and the related proficiency level descriptors. So the 3rd and 4th component of the standards framework connect together using the communication modes. So let's go and look at the relationship between these language expectations and their mode here. And I'll actually do that with an interpretive one as well. So you can see here's the language expectation and the related proficiency level descriptor. You can click on that blue area. Next, let's explore the expressive language expectations. And you can use the notes view to go and locate language features that can be used to carry out different language functions. So going back to this example, I'll go back to expressive. Here on the tile on the right, you see the language expectation, and this is a language function right here. And then down here in the notes view, you have that language function, and below it are the language features that are used to go and carry it out. So this is the actual language development learning that students will be working on. Okay, and next, you can use the search tool. You can conduct simple searches, you can narrow your searches using drop-down menus, and you can click on that robot face and to start an artificial intelligence search. So with that artificial intelligence search, you're looking for similar roots and near matches. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So here's the drop-down menu that appears. You can limit your searches, and one of the things you want to do is typically you'll have the notes view will not be selected, And so you want to go down and add that notes view. And that's especially helpful if you're using the expressive language features. Remember how that comes down, and the notes view, it'll allow you to search the notes view in the expressive language expectations. Next. Last two tools are two types of layouts that might be helpful. There's a tiles layout and there's a table layout. So let's look at the tiles layout first. I'm going to go to the 3 bullets in the upper right hand corner, and I'm going to move from a tree structure, which is what is showing right now on the screen, over to a tile layout. And the bolding shows what changes as the level increases. And then I'm going to click on those 3 bullets again, and I'm going to change it to a table layout. And with the table layout, you can also export a copy of the WIDA Standards Framework. The Standards Framework is open source. We want you to download it. We want you to use it. So we hope this tour has been helpful. Digitized standards can support planning, collaboration, and sharing among educators. They can help you more easily identify standard-aligned resources, present new ways to make language visible within content and in the service of learning. You can find out more information on the WIDA website at wida.wisc.edu or check out your state or local education agency websites. Thanks very much.
So on your handout, I'm actually going to go to that website and just kind of show you, kind of simplify it. And that's what the handout does. The second handout that I gave you just kind of simplifies how you would go through and look at different standards. But if you first pull the website up, and you don't have to log in to use this, I'm sure that there are more features if you have the capability of logging in. I'm not sure if this is a purchase item but this is free to us to access the WIDA standards, and it is actually linked to the WIDA website. But when you first pull it up, you can click on the WIDA standards, but if you pull it up, it tells you how you can look at each one. So on the handout, that first section that says what are 3 ways that you can dive in, those are the 3 ways that you can dive in. You can look at the language expectation by standard statement and by grade level. You can look at it by key language uses and the communication mode, or you can look at it by the proficiency descriptors and the grade level clusters that also include communication. So there's 3 ways that you can dive into it. I will say a disclaimer, I'm not an expert in using this. I have played around with it, and these are the things that I have found to be helpful. If we just clicked on the language expectations, I'm just going to click on the first tile, but in the video they showed you that you can do a tile view and you can do a tree view. So it just, your preference as to how you look at it. I like boxes. I'm easier with boxes. It just makes me happy.
And I like the table.
Makes me very happy when things are very organized. So if you click on the language expectations, that arrow is going to break it down into each of your language standards. And so if you look at 2, and if you're following along on your laptop, and if you're following along with the handout, it's just a breakdown of the standards that we've talked about earlier in the presentation. So you've got those social and instructional purposes. Again, we said those did not change. Nothing has changed about those. So you have the same standards that are for social instructional, the language arts, the science, language of math, science, and then the language of social studies. So if you're filling in your handy dandy guided notes that I always tell them that they need to complete in my high school classes, you would be looking at the number 2 on your handout. So I'm just going to let you click on a standard that you would like to focus on. I'm going to click on the first one just because that's the one that, actually I think I'm going to do language arts. Yeah. I'll do language arts because that's a lot of what we do. If you click on that though, you can see it breaks it down even further by grade level. So it's got grade level clusters. So if you are kindergarten, you can click on that. If you are grade 1, you can click on that one. Whatever your grade level is, the one that you want to click on and kind of explore. But if you notice at the bottom, it still keeps the other two boxes up at the bottom. So if you decide, I really want to look at key language use, you can go back to that, or you could go back to grade level and proficiency level. So it still keeps those up so that you can identify those.
I would just add at this point, one of the things I really like about this in terms of creating lesson plans, think about your evaluations. If you go to language expectations and proficiency level when I know I'm going to be evaluated, or I kind of, they're working their way down the hall, on my standards, I'll have the language expectations and the proficiency level. And that way, they can see, instead of focusing strictly on the content of my lesson, even though my lesson is going to be a content standard, I want them to focus on that language development piece, okay? So if they can see, if my supervisor, if my AP sees, this is what is expected at this particular level, and this is what the student is doing in terms of proficiency and performance, then they know, even if my child doesn't understand the next step in the water cycle, they're able to use the language to communicate to me all the right, language pieces to express their understanding, or even if it's a misunderstanding, they're still hitting their language standard. Does that make sense?
And you've got your interpretive, this is for narrative and informative if you're doing 2nd or 3rd grade, and you've got your expressive and you've got your interpretive. It also highlights that key language that's different. They were saying in the video that's, you want to focus on. This is great if you're collaborating with a teacher to sit down and pull this up and say, hey, look, I got this. Let me pull this up and let's see what you're doing and how this ties in with my language standards, and we can use both of those standards together. So you can break it down. So key information that each standard provides to begin your lesson planning. Well, it gives you your grade cluster. So if you're following along with your guided notes, it's number 3. It gives you the grade cluster. It gives you the key language uses, gives you the standard statement, and then it gives you the communication mode. So you're getting all of that with just clicks and not having to go through that manual. And, okay, what page is that on? Okay, where is grade 2 and 3?
Right.
Where is high school? I got to find the proficiency level, then I got to find the grade level, then I got to find the model performance indicator. Okay, then I want the strand. So it really kind of makes it a nice, neat package when you can just click and look at each one.
Much easier to navigate.
Yeah. So just on number 4, I just wanted you to kind of input your own details from your selected standard. And I gave you an example on the back page. I just gave you an example of grade level 4, and it gives you the standard, and it kind of breaks it down. But you're welcome to kind of explore that and input your own details based on what you teach and what you're working on. Not that you have to do that right this minute, but you can go back and do that later if you want to just kind of fill in some information.
So it looks like we've got about 15 minutes left, and so we want you guys to have, 5-10 minutes to kind of navigate on your own and complete those guided notes, and then come back to us with questions and concerns, and then we'll also take questions from our virtual participants.
If you click on that little triangle, it will expand it, and the other thing I wanted to show you is the push pin, because you can pin that and then you can later print that, or you can copy it and add it to a lesson plan, and then you're not writing, handwriting with the old school lesson template that we used to use that was great at the time, but we all know that technology is where we are, where we're going. Even with our kids, we have to give them those technology tools. So hopefully this is a great tool that you can use and you can take back and share and collaborate with your teachers at your
schools?
Ultimately, what we're trying to do is accomplish two things, and that's save you time and sharpen your focus. And if you can do those two things, you'll be a happier teacher. Save time,
Yes,
sharpen your focus. Let's get to what we need to do.
Right, right. And hopefully we answered those essential learning questions at the beginning. You know, what are those differentiated instruction? How are we going to do that with the WIDA standards? What are the differences? What is the expressive mode that they've added, the interpretive mode that they've added? What do they mean by multimodality? What about the functional language aspect of it? Hopefully we have kind of broken that down and made that a little bit more simplified. But to me, this is the ultimate resource. Do you think this is pretty cool? Like, didn't know about this before, never seen this. This is quite helpful. This makes my life easier. Any comments, questions, concerns? Love it? Love it? Yay. I'm all about making my life easier and collaboration easier. And this is a great, you can copy and paste this, send it to your teachers. Oh, you're doing this because in high school we don't always have time to meet. We do a lot of emailing with our teachers. This is a great tool. Just copy, paste, email, hey, use this. This is a great standard. You know, we all do desktop monitoring, right? We all have to turn in lesson plans when we do desktop monitoring, and those lesson plans need to include language standards. And usually they come to me and say, we need a lesson plan with language standards embedded for biology. So this is a copy and paste. It's an easy tool to slide those language standards in when you need those for documentation, and they need to be on an actual lesson plan.
Shelley, I had a couple of really good questions. A couple of folks asked, you know, where do I find my students' proficiency level and their can-do statements? So you will have that yourself. So what I normally do is I pull up my students' WIDA scores. And for each one of my students, you know, I've got a little spreadsheet that shows exactly what they scored in each one. And then I take their scores, their WIDA scores, because I have that information, and I use that to design the lesson plan for my student. And then I go to that particular performance indicator, and then find out where my student is in comparison to that. Does that make sense? So you'll use what you already have and combine it with this resource to help design your lessons.
And we want that, you know, we want that to go along with those ELA standards and those math standards and your social studies standards, because that's what, you know, that's what the state is doing when they meet next month, is they're taking these standards and hopefully that's going to be an easy, you know, we can pull that up and that's going to have those language standards and those content standards. Make our life much easier.
So what observations did you all find as you were navigating through there? What did you find perhaps that was most helpful?
I personally really like the summative page for the expressive and interpretive standards, where it shows each of the levels. That's really helpful in constructing our classroom rubrics and stuff, at least personally.
Right, exactly. And for me, that helps my AP, when they come in to evaluate me, it helps them to focus on what the student is actually doing.
And like she's pointing out, the actual actionable words are bolded. You know, like compound versus simple sentences. Compound is bolded, simple is bolded. Like it's drawing their attention to things that are measurable in those.
Drawing their attention to things that are measurable.
Right.
I
So
love
if you didn't hear what he said he really likes the interpretive and the expressive functions on there, and the important information, the action is bolded. So if someone walked in your classroom and you had these printed out and paste, you know.
Right. Post them in the wall.
Post them, thank you. Post them on your boards, on your whiteboards, or have them showing in your classroom, because I like for my kids to go over their daily learning targets. What are you accomplishing today, and what are my expectations that when you leave my classroom, this is what you should leave being able to do. So I post my information in user-friendly terms. I'm obviously not going to give a student these terms, but that's great for your administration. It's great to share with your content teachers, and then you can put it in more simplified, student-friendly terms for those daily learning targets.
I think what's hard for our administrators, unless you have an administrator who started as an ESL teacher, which is rare. You know, we love what we do and we stay with what we love, right? But unless you have an administrator who at one time taught ESL, they don't really know what language growth looks like. Going back to your point about measurable indicators, you know, if you have that language standard on your lesson plan, posted in your room, then they walk in and they know what to expect and they know whether or not you're doing it.
Questions on virtual? Any virtual questions?
Yes, we do have a couple of questions. From earlier in the presentation, from Andrea, neither representing nor viewing is assessed on WIDA Access. How would you suggest focusing on these areas?
I mean, I focus on it just because I know at the high school level, viewing and representing is huge. They are in math classes, they are in science classes, they are always reading charts and data, and so I incorporate that within my own classroom, within our text. I'll use ACT practice questions. Those are ways that I include it at the high school level. But does anybody else have any suggestions for representing and viewing? Because those aren't really, I mean, in a way they are, because they do have charts and diagrams and things on and equations on
Access. They're going to see it.
They're going to see it. We don't get information per se about.
They're going to see representations and they will see images. We know that. We know that they're going to have to interpret what's being presented to them, and that's not just text. And they're going to have to make evaluations, and then they're going to have to express their own understanding based on those representations. And so we as language teachers, we have to help them to interpret, synthesize, and then express their understanding. And that has to be something that we do on a consistent basis.
And I think creating, I mean, we're talking about viewing and representing. They're not just viewing, but by representing, you're having them create charts, diagrams, documents, you know, captions for pictures. We all know that captions are important, and we need to teach the purpose of captions, which, you know, that can be included in your lesson as well, but having them caption pictures. I think those are all ways that you can include viewing and representing.
And kind of going back to the question, yes, they're not, at this point, not going to be asked to create a bar graph as part of their access test, but in my opinion, that is not the only measure of success for a multilingual in the state of Tennessee. They're also going to be taking that TCAP. They're also going to have grade level success. They're also going to get a report card. So we have to look at the total preponderance of evidence to tell us whether or not that student is actually performing at the level that we want them to perform.
Yeah, because on EOCs and on ACTs and on TCAP, we all know they are going to see those things, and our kids are not exempt. So
I hope that answered it.
Thank you.
We have a question over here.
If we're talking about viewing and expressing, there are lots of ways that we assess that as well with when we use any sort of video that we embed questions in, there are different platforms for that, Nearpod and things like that. And so expressing is when we ask them to present, and that is an oral type of thing, and that it leads into speaking and writing. And so I think that WIDA is not putting that in as a specific standard that they're assessing, but we're using those to incorporate how students show what they know or show their comprehension.
Right.
So viewing is just interpreting that data, and representing is them creating that.
Okay, and I think for our last question, what do you talk about or present to your teachers at the ESL Roundtable? I know we could do a whole presentation on that, couldn't we?
That's a great
But in
question.
about a minute or 2 minutes,
Well, I mean, we could sum it up in that one slide that we had where there were 4 different stages. It was the data. Who are your students at the beginning of the school year? Who are your students? Where are we in terms of the can start? I told you I'm stealing that. So I've always done can do, but we're going to call it can start. So where are they in terms of their language proficiency level? What did their benchmark data look like last year? How did they do on their TCAP? How long have they been in the country? So we're going to get to know our students. Then we talk about what are our growth goals for this year. How is the ILP going to help us facilitate that growth? What sort of accommodations, modifications, scaffolding can you do in order to help move that student? And where are the gaps between the content standards and the language proficiency that our student is at this point? And mostly I tell them, come see me. Come see me. And my door is always open. My principal has my classroom smack dab in the middle of the school so that everybody can come. I'm like, just pop in. I don't care if I have a class. Pop in and say, hey, just so you know, our science project is coming up, and so, Jimmy has, the water cycle, whatever. And talk to me. When you get a minute, come see me and tell me how I can support him. And it's kind of like that. And I listen to them, and I listen to their concerns, and I find that a lot of times that hasn't happened. And we want them to talk to us and tell us, what are your concerns and how can I help you?
I know there's interest in this room on this question of the ESL Roundtable because I've already heard comments about it. But Shelley, Catherine, this was fabulous. Thank you.
Well, please, they have access to our PowerPoint, right?
Yes.
Please steal from us. Yes. You are welcome. We are giving you permission. We have no copyrights. If you have to go back and present, which we all will present in the fall, take the simplified information from this PowerPoint and just create your professional development. Hey, it's this easy. So we love to share, we love to collaborate, we love to network, and you are welcome to anything that is on our PowerPoint.
Absolutely. We're happy to share, and we're thankful that we had an opportunity to get to know you and to work with you. Feel free to reach out to us. One of my favorite mentors ever, and he was the same man that hired us both for ESL years ago, he said, good teachers poach. You find another good teacher and they're willing to share, you poach their stuff and bring it over. So good teachers poach. So don't feel, don't be hesitant. If there's anything we can share with you, we will. We're all in this together and we need to support one another. We can't do it alone.